It's Sushant, and I'm here to talk about a spoiler-heavy Dune Part 2. Spoilers coming up ahead, please. If you haven't seen the movie, watch the movie. Well, if you've read the book, actually, you should still watch the movie, because it turns out there's a lot of differences between the book and the movie as well. I'm going to spoil the heck out of this. 3, 2, 1, go. So first off, in the book, apparently there's like an 8-year time jump. There's a lot of interesting things that happen in the book that didn't happen in the movie, but I still, from my understanding, the adaptation seems interesting and to the point. The film follows a pretty tight timeline. It directly follows the events of the first one, of course, like probably down to like the hour. I don't think it really jumps much in time. And then the film in and of itself doesn't really span much time beyond that. It's quite interesting in that regard. It only strikes me now that I was watching a very tightly knit film in terms of the story, in spite of it feeling like there's a lot of things happening. Maybe the film lasts a week in total. There are beautiful and amazing things to witness and observe in Dune. Of course, visually, Dune is a spectacle for a reason. I saw it in 70mm IMAX, even though it was shot digitally. That being said, watching it at IMAX was awesome. Being overwhelmed by some of the imagery, the worms especially, was awesome. You know, the visual effects, of course, it doesn't matter how big the screen is, they are perfect through and through. Much like the first one, technologically, you get to see a lot of interesting things in this world. There's a lot of potential for themes that are introduced, but the potential isn't seen through. And I think that's the big bummer here for me, is that Dune Part 2, much like the first one, has a beautiful atmosphere. The first one, though, is a lot tamer in its pace. It almost allows you to breathe that in, and it doesn't necessarily give you too much in terms of the character and the movement and progression of events as much as the second one does. But the second one does that in a way that doesn't feel satisfying, because it almost feels like it's still in service of the grander scheme of the world. And of course, again, from what I've heard, if you've read the books, there's a lot more that you'll enjoy here. There's a lot more that you'll understand. But the film kind of, it both moves at a breakneck pace in a good way and in a negative way. It moves at a breakneck pace in a way that there's a lot of stuff happening that you're excited to see, but it also moves at that same pace in a negative way that you just kind of have to buy into and accept the way this world works. There isn't a ton of logic, whether it's about water or the blue drink that has so much, of an impact on the plot in this film. You just kind of have to accept that these are things, that this is just the science fiction nature of things, and there you go. That's just it. Okay, I don't really know what's happening right now, but sure, it's just happening. I'm going to let it happen and move on. And that's kind of how I felt like a lot of through a lot of this film, not just from the perspective of the movement of certain technological things, but also in terms of the characters, because my gosh, we're spoiling. Timothee Chalemet is a wonderful performer. His character, Paul Atreides, learns that he is actually a descendant of the Harkonnens, which is, of course, the villainous side of this film and the story. He just immediately turns on a dime and is like, oh, I'm a Harkonnen. I guess I'm just going to use my Harkonnen ways, which could have been interesting, which could have been something that was delved into, or could have felt justified if it was clear that Paul was already struggling with his leadership ways, but it didn't necessarily feel like that. The only things we really see of Paul are that, like, he's not accepted by the Fremen as much, but it isn't anything about him feeling secluded or feeling he's not able to lead because he's an Atreides. It's just because he's not a Fremen. So him being a Harkonnen, to me, didn't feel as impactful to his character as the film wanted me to believe it was, to the point that he suddenly becomes kind of an iron fist ruler. And again, Timothee's performance is phenomenal in that scene. Him riling the troops is amazing. But it doesn't really feel warranted. And then his, I guess, the foil to his character is Austin Butler, who's phenomenal. His Fade Routha, who's introduced in one scene, a fantastic scene, probably my favorite part of the thing, visually, in terms of the mood and the intensity, all of it, the best part of the movie, in my opinion. They go face to face in this very, like, simple fight. People are standing around and watching, and it's sort of, and it's like, oh, there was this whole actual army on army war going on, but now there's like this gentlemanly, dare I say, form of a duel that's happening that determines the fate, and it's almost just like, okay, this is it. This is all we're seeing. They're not really engaging much with one another. It doesn't seem like Paul is learning anything from this. It's just kind of happens. A lot of things in this film feel like they kind of happen. And I think the problem is that there's just enough in the way that they're presented and expertly presented to you that you're like, oh, I'm intrigued by this. But that intrigue is never followed through on. That intrigue never feels like it has anything that pays it off. It just kind of is on the surface. You accept it as a thing and you move on to the next thing. And that's what kind of felt like a bit of a disconnect throughout. Whether it's the battle with Austin Butler and Timothee Chalamet that could have been amazing and big and awesome, I didn't really get any of that. Whether it is, Timothy's character change, whether it's Lady Jessica, who is Paul Atreides' mother, her arc is particularly interesting. She is pregnant. She consumes a certain liquid. There's communication with her and her unborn child. Anya Taylor-Joy shows up for a minute. It's a really interestingly presented thing, but again, it doesn't necessarily... I am shown that she changes. I don't necessarily know why, and the only explanation that the film has is that she drank a blue liquid. And that, to me, is the bummer. That, to me, is this investment in the not even the physiological, but the physical elements of this world, the mechanical elements of this world that expect me to believe all of the character changes that take place, all of the motivations that take place that I didn't, or that at least I had a tough time buying, because I myself haven't read the books. I'm not invested in the lore the way a lot of the viewers probably are. And hey, there was applause in my theater, so clearly a lot of the people that read the books or a lot of people that are fans of the franchise would probably understand this a little bit better than I did, but I didn't quite find myself connecting with enough things. And I know I've said, let's talk about some of the good stuff. Okay, let us talk about the aesthetic. Let us delve into each little part. There are some moments, there's this Messiah-like story that's presented, or the idea of worship and whether or not Paul Atreides is the savior of the Fremen. There are some visual moments, in particular, an overhead visual shot of this big crowd, and you have Paul Atreides walking through the crowd, and it's almost like wherever he is, like there's space created for him. He stands out from the crowd, visually simple, phenomenal, and clear to the point of what is happening, who Paul is in the presence of the others. There are many moments like that take place, but they're not in service of a story within that, or they're not in service of exploring the theme enough that it amounts to anything, which is just kind of the bummer. Let's look at some of the other visuals. When it comes to the action stuff specifically, the action is very clear. You spend a lot more time primarily on sand, but in spite of that, there's a great texture to it. In spite of that, you can feel the depth of the world you're in, the depth of the infinite sand dune that you're existing on a lot of the time. You're able to see people riding worms, which should be a very over-the-top, wacky thing, but it is actually executed in a way that it feels very perfect in this world too. So I'm really impressed by that. A lot of the fight scenes are paced really well. There's, beautiful sound editing and things like that. Again, very different in its execution from the first one. The first one kind of used sound to ease you into a world. This one kind of used sound to, I guess, elevate a lot of the intense moments that are happening and distinguish certain beats from one another. So it's a very different paced film in general. So the use of sound in and of itself is incredibly different. And of course, it mixes well with the music. The music didn't have any standout themes the way they did in the first one. Of course, when Paul's dream, comes back in this one, it doesn't hold as much meaning as it did in the first one, but it's still a wonderful soundtrack to listen to and something I'm definitely going to be playing later on. The design of the world, there's particularly some of the Harkonnens, I guess foot soldiers, the ones that fly in the first scene or two. I was quite taken aback in amazement with how awesome those suit designs were. And then the way they fly isn't, over the top sci-fi-esque. It's very, simple. They just kind of almost float. All the technology feels very specific and thought out and well within the world and very much lines up with what we know and understand about the way this world functions. the Emperor's world, and Florence Pugh, who also strangely enough is set up as the narrator of this film and then disappears for a good hour and a half before she returns again. There's some costumes that she's in specifically that are very, unique, but ultimately, of course, show you, some of the class dichotomy in this film. There's a certain elegance, dare I say, to the Emperor's world. There's a certain different kind of minimalist yet marble-esque sophistication to the Emperor's world. And it's really easy to see that in contrast with the Fremen, who are existing in tight spaces, mostly in sand, who rely on nature and rather the raw materials of nature to survive, whereas the Emperor has a completely, dare I say, unnatural looking world that he exists in. They're playing chess with this board made out of metal, the thrones that they sit on. It's all very clear that these are two starkly different people, but the Emperor's purpose and the Emperor feeling like this grand objective to come across, at least that's how it was set up to me, is kind of forgotten. So again, great in execution, but to what point? The Harkonnens, I will say, though, that Austin Butler scene I was talking about earlier, where he's introduced and he's in this gladiator-esque fight, fighting three Fremen on his birthday, and Baron Harkonnen's kind of sitting way up top watching him, and you see it leads to some interactions between the two later on. The lighting of that scene, it's this almost washed out black and white scene that really is one of the many ways in which the Harkonnen specifically have their own energy and vibe. And again, great contrast to Paul Atreides, great contrast to the Fremen. The design of their world is so sadistically and sickly evil, and Austin Butler's, costume, lack of hair, whatever it is, there's something about it that is so sadistically and sickly evil that amounts to making me feel a lot more when we see him up against Paul. The Emperor, not as much. The Harkonnens, absolutely. The Harkonnens were my favorite part of this film. Give us a Harkonnen spinoff. What are we waiting for? Moving on to some other things. When it came to the writing specifically, of course, Dune has been this whole unadaptable, work of art over the years. And there's the 1984 David Lynch Dune, of course, that has its own somewhat over-the-top interpretation of Dune itself. This is very different, much longer, a little more subdued, a little more atmospheric, to say the least. But it is something that, has been considered unadaptable and has been considered, this Jodorowsky was supposed to have a version of Dune that people were really hyped about. All that aside, they do a good job of making the world feel rich. The world feels like it has a lot going on. Part of that is in the writing, part of that is in the filming and its execution. It's really, and the design, of course. There's a ton of detail with every little thing happening in this film that really gives you the sense that this is a fully realized world, that each of the factions, whether it's the Harkonnens, the Fremen, the Emperors, even Atreides to some extent, each of them are starkly and distinctly different in their look, their purpose, their abilities, and even the Bene Gesserit. You see they're the ones that have the voice that can sort of tell people or make people do certain things. They are sort of these very purpose-driven people with regards to, they have their own outlook on how they have to save the world and their purpose within it. And so each of the factions has their own very specific, unique thing. The sort of technology they use to fight is all very different, but all representative of where they are, whether it's in terms of economic class, whether it's in terms of, ecological output, especially the Fremen especially, are very much about preserving their land. They are very much the common folk, dare I say. And so I think all of that is amazing. And I think the way it's presented in a lot of wide shots to kind of give you a sense of the scenes and settings that we're in really adds to that. And I think it's a phenomenal job done there. It, again, sets up these things that don't necessarily amount to much by the end. So it's interesting. And it's an interesting dilemma I have in terms of, I love you, but I can't fully commit to you because I'm trying to get the point of view. I don't know if that made sense. But that being said, when it came to certain moments, I think the depiction of Lady Jessica's unborn child is one of the most visually stunning things that reminded me so much of the first Dune, where there's this hypnotic form of an edit, this hypnotic form of a visual and pacing and timing that makes it clear immediately what is happening. It's sort of like Paul's premonitions, and when he's trying to use the voice on Lady Jessica to tell her to like pass him the water in the first film, it's cut in this very specific, perfectly paced manner that makes you understand it's a voice and he's not fully learning his powers yet or doesn't know how to use them. The same way in which you're so clearly able to tell that there is communication happening with an unborn fetus inside someone's stomach. That should not be clear, but it is. And it is so perfectly executed. To me, one of the most fascinating things about this film, one of the most sci-fi-esque things about this film. And, you know, there are many gems like that in this film. So when you have Javier Bardem, is hilarious in this film, by the way. There's this whole ongoing debate about whether or not Paul Atreides is essentially the savior, the messiah, the chosen one that they have. And the way in which that dialogue and exchange takes place over time consistently is sort of planted well. It's simple and part and a essential and unique part of each scene, and it builds. It doesn't amount to something at the end, but from Javier Bardem's perspective and that arc, his character probably had the most complete arc. Him and Austin Butler had the most complete arc in this film, to my opinion. Not that Paul Atreides, Timothee Chalamet, did not have an arc in this film, but the way it sort of turns out is very quick. It's very random in terms of, to me at least, his change in character. One of the most, dare I say, frustrating things about this movie is Paul Atreides is awesome, but he's just like, oh, I'm actually a Harkonnen. I descend from terrible people, so I'm now going to be terrible in my leadership. And I don't think you have to like your protagonist. What I like about this film compared to like some, of the earlier sci-fi that we've seen, in the last 50 years or so, is the element of gray, is the element that within these colonial structures that you can't love Paul Atreides either. Other than the common folk, it's kind of hard to love anyone because they're all either exorbitantly wealthy, abusing their power, or kind of have their own selfish purpose. And I think that does come across, which is a really good point made in this film. But in spite of that, it seems like Paul's intentions are good, but then they're suddenly not. I would rather have there been kind of a debate earlier on as to where is Paul coming from? What does he really want? So when he learns he's a Harkonnen, it changes a lot. It kind of reminds me really enough of Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, where, like, spoilers on that too, Rey learns she's a Palpatine, and it's like, okay, this is information about her descendancy. It doesn't seem like it would have any impact on her character. There's some internal debate, but it doesn't ever feel like she is someone who seems to be, who's going to be emotionally affected by it to the point that she's going to change who she is and her entire outlook and what she's going to do and her objectives. Happened in that film, happened in this film. It was kind of odd and a real sudden left turn in the film that then leads to this conclusion that is about, this eventual holy war that's going to take place that feels somewhat setting up a sequel-esque and inconclusive once again. There's a way in which you could perceive it as a conclusion that, oh, if the story was about Paul's fall from grace, him not being accepted by the other houses, and eventually saying he's going to start a holy war, that's the end of a story. The story is not about Paul's fall from grace. It is simply about Paul trying to lead the Fremen against the Harkonnens and the Emperor because he wants to do it for his family. I can see a distant link or disconnect in him learning that that's not his heritage, to him not doing that, but it also isn't set up enough that I now believe that him learning that he's not, true Atreides blood or has Harkonnen blood in him suddenly then means that he's going to turn on a dime. It doesn't seem like his investment with the world had anything to do solely with him being an Atreides. It seemed like the beginning moment of why he does what he does, but he seems invested for so many other reasons. He seems invested in Zendaya's character and being in love with her, and then it's like, no, I'm a Harkonnen now, so I have to now marry the Emperor's daughter instead because it's all strategic. And there's a hint at strategic relationships made, that doesn't, again, feel like it's naturally happening for this character. It feels sudden, it feels out of place, and I'm okay not loving your lead character, but I want to understand my lead character to some extent. I don't have to relate to them, but I want their actions and motivations to make some sense, and it feels like it doesn't. It feels like it leads to this inconclusive film that also closes on Zendaya about to ride a worm, and again, why are we closing on her? This is her story of being like, she's upset at Paul and going away, but I don't think her character was the inlet to the audience either enough for me to be like, oh, let's walk away from this atrocity and this atrocious form of leadership. It's very much just like, we are now cutting to her, and it creates this feeling of incompleteness that the first one definitely had, but the first one had it in a way that it's like, we're not going to, from a plot perspective, really have a bow tied on this, which was a common complaint for the first one, which is one that I held too, but it had me eager about the next one. This one felt emotionally inconclusive to the point that I almost felt shortchanged and unsure of what to expect versus excited about what's next. And so I'm sure there's going to be a Dune Part 3, and I'm obviously going to watch it because, again, one of the most visually stunning things that I've seen and will ever see is, Dune Part 1 and Dune Part 2. But I can't get myself to say that this was an emotionally riveting experience the way that I hoped it was. I was expecting or praying in certain moments. This film almost seemed to promise this, transcendent religious experience and would hopefully change my outlook on worship. But quite frankly, it seemed so concerned with the lore and the world itself that it, dare I say, forgot about that after a point. That being said, fantastic performances, a technical masterpiece, and a good film that could have been so much more to me. I'd still recommend Dune Part 2, and I'd still say it's worth a shot because I think a lot of people could absorb different things from this film, so I definitely say it's worth checking out. That being said, thank you so much for watching this, long, spoiler-heavy review. What did you think of Dune Part 2? Please comment below. My socials, if you want to talk to me outside of this, are in the description below as well. There's a lot happening on the AR channel. Check out our Patreon for, live full-length reactions and, more Indian cinema coming up as well in terms of the things we're going to be talking about and reacting to. So check that out, and I'll see you next time.